Hello and welcome, Inspired Podcast community. This is your new episode. My name is Caroline, and my today's guest is Keeper Catran-Whitney, and I hope I pronounced your name right. Tell me about that.
The last name is pronounced Catran-Whitney, but you were very good. So you get a 2 thumbs up.
Thank you so much. I'm in Germany. I'm from Germany, so I apologize. And I want to introduce you to the audience a little bit.
Thank you.
You have a transformative message about leadership and personal growth that will deeply resonate with our audience today. By facing hard truth, you help leaders unlock their potential, gain new perspectives, and develop empathy, ultimately enhancing their leadership skills. Please tell us more about your daily work.
Okay, I am the author of the book Helplessness, the emotional health challenges brothers experience once we learn our sisters have been sexually abused by our parents. So the question immediately becomes, when was the last time you thought about brothers and the trauma that they experience once they learn their sisters have been sexually abused? If you're like most people, you've never given it a thought. It has never run across your mind because when the exposure comes out, just about everyone else gets attention in one way or another, be it the predator who gets negative attention or the survivors, which are the sisters, or in this case, women. The question also then becomes, how come no one ever asks about the brothers? How come no one ever considers whether or not we are dealing with trauma? And then what happens when we try to navigate our lives forward? How do we pick up the pieces? How do we find hope? And how do we find the ability to try to become better in the midst of all this PTSD? For me and my brothers, it was incredibly difficult. We were on the verge of signing the largest new artist contract Motown Records offered anyone, because at that time in 1977, we were incredibly popular singers. And so our life of abject poverty, I went to 11 grade schools before I graduated high school. I lived in 21 different places before I moved out. I was homeless 3 times. And so how do you go forward? I would say it comes down to one word, and just about any leader will tell you it comes down to one word, and that word is choice. You can either choose to move forward, you can choose to remain stagnant, or you can choose to go backward and live. Stagnant, all the stagnation is in essence going backward. So my daily life consists of, how do I focus on my life so that I can enrich not only myself, but others. And the immediate others are my family. I have a couple of kids, and I just had a grandson about 3 months ago. So my life is filled with choosing to go forward in the midst of so much trauma. And for me, knowing the woulda, coulda, shoulda moments in learning about what happened becomes very difficult, because when you're talking about a life that is filled with trauma, anything can trigger you. Anything could send you backward. It could be a song, it could be a movie, it could be a conversation. And you have to constantly be aware of your surroundings and who you are and what you are going through. And so this is the conversation that Caroline and I are going to have. So Caroline, thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. Sounds fantastic. And you talked about the choice we have to either move backwards or move forward. And what inspired you to choose moving always forward?
I was about 16 or 17 years old when I learned about my sisters. And the trauma was so devastating that when you are a young man of that age, how do you handle that? The news that you could never prepare for, the news you never expect to hear. How do you do that? You have just realized that your family and your life was not what you thought it was. For me, it was about trying to tether myself emotionally. There's a lot of talk these days about mental health. And the problem for me with mental health, when most of us are suffering some sort of trauma, is that mental health is logical. Mental health speaks singularity. It's your problem. You are alone. And so, with my book, Hopefulness, which is book one of a 3-book series from helplessness to hopefulness to happiness, which is eventually where I got to 45 years later. Mental health does not speak of a shared experience. And I think anytime you're talking about leadership, anytime you're talking about overcoming trauma, it must be a shared experience. And so that's why I look at the emotional health challenges that people go through, because emotional health means inclusion. Emotional health also means it's about feelings. And so when you're in a world that is about everyone telling you you can't do something, you can't achieve something, that you have to try to figure it out on your own, the reality is you don't, but you have to realize who you are. You have to realize that in order for you to go where it is you want to go, you have to embrace the difficult times. I mean, you really have to own them. And then you have to step into that space so that you can begin to look at where it is you need to go next. For me, as I said, it was tethering myself, but the motivating factor for me came down to my 4 sisters. I had lost them. And oftentimes when you are in a leadership situation, it feels like you're losing something. You have to give up something to get to where it is you want to go. For me, I had just lost my family. I had just lost my sister. So I had to figure out, how do I get back to them? But getting back to them was very difficult because they did not want anything to do with me. And so it is a very difficult proposition. The energy that must be spent must be introspection. You have to look at yourself and be real about it. You must accept that what and who you are in that moment is your reality. Then for me, it was the steps. I had to identify those people, places, and things that could pull me out of the darkness. And then I also had to go with the most difficult test was I had to make calls. I had to talk to my sisters because without that, I would always be held hostage to the trauma. Making those difficult decisions, which is where the biggest choice comes from. You have to be willing to make the choices that no one wants to make, the ones that are really frightening, especially when they are emotional choices. Anyone can look at something logically from my perspective and say, okay, I've got to do this, this, this. But it's the emotional underpinnings that make things very, very difficult. And making those calls, knowing that my sisters wanted nothing to do with me, knowing that they wanted nothing to do with their 3 brothers, and actually considered us to be enemies was very, very hard. But the enemy of stagnation and the enemy of not going forward is you've got to make the choice and then go forward.
Okay, I see. So you said you made the choice to talk to your sisters and they were not willing to talk to you. And
No.
what so how did you make the choice? Why was it so important for you? And how did this happen that you talked again to that you talked that you had a conversation that they said yes to it?
As I said, we are talking about something incredibly emotional. When I learned about what happened to my sister, what happened immediately was my oldest sister turned around and pointed at her 4 brothers and said, you can't talk about it. It didn't happen to you. The trauma and the pain has nothing to do with you. You can't talk about it ever. And the relationships between brothers and sisters, Caroline, that was so tight, they lay broken. Immediately, you are dropped into a void. You are dropped into this emotional abyss of darkness. And when the people I needed to speak to the most, my sisters, just told me they wanted nothing to do with me, I went to my bedroom, and it was like walking into a a whirlpool. There, I was just being spun around, and I was drowning and being pulled down. Uh, there were woulda, coulda, shoulda moments, and you start to blame, which is what I did. The guilt and the shame started to just engulf me, because how could I not know something like that was happening in my house? And then to be told by my sisters, you can't talk about it. It took me years. It took me 45 years to find the courage to speak to my sisters. The the message that you can't talk about it, and these are messages that people get all the time. You're not good enough. You're not worthy. You are not someone we want to deal with because there's something missing. And in my case, for my sisters, what was missing was just that I was like my stepfather. What was between his legs, what was between my legs, and that automatically made me guilty, even though I knew nothing about it. What helped me was about 30 years later, I had gone to a speak and write course put together by the great Lisa Nichols on how to write a book. But before I was going to write this book, I felt, in order for me to feel good about this, in order for me to feel good about myself, in order for me to reclaim my self-esteem and self-worth, I need to tell my sisters I'm going to write the book Helplessness. It's a brother's story. It is purely from a brother's perspective. I decided to make the most difficult call of my life. I called my second sister and I said, I need to come over and talk to you. Now, this is something most people do not do. We will find excuse after excuse not to make the hard decision, not to make the difficult choice that we all know needs to be made. So I called my sister and I said, I need to talk to you because I'm going to write a book and I want you to know about it before it comes out. And so I went over to her house and we stood outside her garage and I'm in tears and I'm telling her, I want to write this book. And Caroline, I'm waiting for the explosion. I'm waiting for my sister to say, you can never write this book. How dare you? It only happened to us girls. But after telling her, I have to write this book from a brother's perspective so other people can learn exactly what brothers go through because we're never in the conversation. We are expected to be blamed for not knowing, but then being expected to answer for our non-participation. Those two things cannot occupy the same space. And yet that's what brothers carry the burden. So I told my sister what I wanted to do, and I waited for the explosion. And this is where time can heal or give you a chance. She looked at me and she said, of course you should write this book. People need to know what brothers have gone through. Of course, it's not my story, it's you boy's story. And Caroline, I'm like, I was thinking to myself, you have got to be kidding me. You all have made it very, very clear we cannot talk about this. And we have not talked about it for 45 years. But I knew in order for me to heal, I need to accept the fact that this is a part of my DNA, all this trauma. And like DNA, there were things that were self-replicating, which was causing me challenges with experiences that I was not only having with women, but it was also beginning to impact my relationship with my children. and I had to put a halt to it. I had to accept that I am in trauma. And then I had to accept that I had to make the hard conversation. And then my sister said, "You must write the book." And I knew there were things I could have, would have, should have done along the way that I didn't. So I then decided, if that's the response that I got from my second sister, the sister who made the proclamation, "You can't talk about it ever," is going to be the most difficult call. She is never going to go for this. But I'm going to write the book anyway because it's a brother story. I go to pick up the phone and I set it down because the phone is weighing 2,000 pounds. I wait 30 minutes. I pick it up, I set it down, I pick it up and I set it down. And this is kind of something that people go through when they're trying to make big choices. We start and then we stop. We start and then we stop because we have imagined what the outcome is going to be long before we even get into it until we stop. And there's a great book by I forget her name, but it's Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. I think what great leaders do is we feel the fear and we do it anyway. And that's really what leadership is all about. Are we okay? Are we comfortable? Are we strong? No, we just know it has to be done. So I finally pick up the phone and I call my sister, the one who said, "You can never talk about this." And I tell her, I'm going to write this book from a brother's perspective because I think our family's experience doesn't need to end in tragedy. It can be used to help others. It doesn't need to be on the dunghill of so many other families that have gone through this sort of thing around the world. Because child sexual abuse crosses religious lines, political lines, wealth lines, education lines, social lines. It crosses oceans. It happens globally. It is a global epidemic. And so I did not want my family to just, our story to just be one of those stories that's just on top of all the other stories. So I told my sister that we can do some good. We don't need to live in darkness. And by talking about it, it will free us. And so I waited for the big explosion from her. She was silent for about 2 minutes. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, she's gonna lose it. But she says, "I think you're right. You should write the book." So again, it comes back to choice. Choosing to go forward through something very, very difficult. The only way to get through anything is you just have to go on the journey. And the journey is going to be fraught with so many potholes, with so many obstacles. There are going to be plenty of reasons to turn around. And there are going to be plenty of people who will encourage you to turn around, to save you from yourself. But leaders know there is no option like that. It's like crossing the Rubicon. You have to burn the boats and you have to go forward. It turns out not only did I write the book, but because I wrote the book, Hopelessness, three of my sisters contribute to the book. The sisters who said they wanted nothing to do with me contribute to the book. And how would that have ever happened if I didn't make the choice to call them and just say, okay, I've got to deal with whatever I'm going to deal with. I have to absorb whatever slings and arrows are going to come my way. But they contributed, and they're going to contribute to hopefulness, and they will contribute to happiness. That's what leadership is. And it's quite funny to me these days that people are asking me to speak uh, at leadership events. They ask me, can you take your family story and frame it like this? Can you take your experience and frame it like this so it fits in this? And oftentimes, Caroline, I look at it and say, my initial thought is, no, that's not what happened, until they said to me, do you realize everything you have done, everything you have experienced, everything you have gone through is about leadership? And oftentimes it takes, people like you who will say, I read your story, I read your bio, and I think there is some value here for people that are in the leadership community, because your education and your background is not traditional in any sense of the word. But yet here you are out on the world stage, you are making contributions, you are uh, trying to help bring voice to a group that has no voice, and that's brothers, when it comes to what happens to us once we learn about our sisters. For women, oftentimes when I'm having this conversation, there will usually be those who say, your sisters are right. It didn't happen to you boys. Well, in fact, it did, because when it happened to them, it happened to the entire family. But what I then have to say is, 6 years before my sisters, me and my older brother were sexually abused by our babysitter almost daily for 6 months. And so I understand both sides of being the direct victim and being the collateral victim. And I think when people are trying to look at leadership and what it takes to be leaders, if we take a step back, we will recognize that our life experiences, for the most part, for just about everyone, gives them a lot of leadership experiences. It is full of leadership experiences, because you have to make hard decisions all the time. And that's really at the heart of what leadership is all about. Are you willing to make the choices that others won't?
Yes, absolutely. And I thank you so much for sharing your experiences. And also, I find it encouraging for the people, I would say, that it is worth it to raise your voice, to step up and tell your story, whether it is on stage or you write a book or both, of course. It is very inspiring for me. And I thank you so much for this interview. I have one last question for you, of course. And this is, when people reach out to you now, after listening to this episode, what can they help you with? And do you have special offers and services?
Yeah, what I would say that people can immediately do is not be afraid to step up and share their story. It's what you just said. It is so important that you share your story for a couple of reasons. First, it is liberating to you, the individual, especially if your story has something to do with trauma. It is, when I finally started doing it, shackles just fell away. And so it's owning your space. We have to get comfortable with owning our space. We have to get comfortable with owning our trauma, because that's really what keeps us locked down. The fear of what people are going to say and do once they learn about it. It's your story, and your story is as important as the next person's story. So by all means, speak up. And if you are a man or a brother who've experienced what I'm talking about, understand you're not alone. Because most of the time we think we are alone, brothers, but you're not. There are hundreds and thousands of men who are going through the same thing. Anyone can go to my website, keepercatran-Whitney.com. There are plenty of free things there, from downloads to interviews. There are plenty of things there that can help you. There are resources there as well. So I want to say that, brothers, we need to elevate our voices in this conversation. By all means, do so, and let's become allies with our sisters, as opposed to what is typically the case, enemies.
Thank you so much. This was really great. I love your message. And I want to emphasize it. Please reach out to Keeper. He's amazing. And I will put the website in the show notes, of course. Check it out. And thank you so much for our interview.
Thank you for having me.
And see you in the next episode.